Have you ever felt a deep spiritual emptiness despite all your prayers and devotions? Have you wondered why your heart feels distant from the divine even when you fulfill all your religious obligations? Tonight, we explore something that the great mystic Ibn Arabi warned about centuries ago. 3 hidden habits that silently create a veil between you and the presence of God. These aren't the obvious sins that people warn you about. These are subtle spiritual diseases that infect even the most devout among us, slowly pushing us away from the divine without us even realizing it. What makes these habits so dangerous is their invisibility. They disguise themselves as virtues, they hide behind good intentions, and they operate in the shadows of our consciousness. By the end of this journey together, you'll understand why your spiritual practices might not be bringing you closer to God, and more importantly, you'll discover how to remove these hidden barriers. The first hidden spiritual habit that distances us from the divine is what Ibn Arabi called the worship of the self-created image of God rather than God himself. This might sound confusing at first, so let me explain. Every person carries within their mind an image of who God is, what God wants, and how God operates. We build this image from our upbringing, our culture, our personal experiences, and our limited understanding. The problem begins when we start worshipping this mental construct instead of surrendering to the infinite reality of the divine. Ibn Arabi teaches us in his masterwork, the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, that God is beyond all conceptions and limitations. He wrote that every person worships what they believe about God, and in doing so, they limit the limitless. Think about this carefully. When you pray, are you speaking to the infinite divine who encompasses all existence, or are you speaking to a version of God that fits comfortably within your understanding? When you make supplications, do you truly surrender to divine wisdom, or do you demand that God conform to your expectations of how a merciful deity should respond? This habit manifests in many ways. It appears when someone says, "A loving God would never allow this suffering," creating a box that God must fit into based on their definition of love. It emerges when we judge others' spiritual paths because they don't align with our conception of proper worship. It reveals itself when we become angry at God for not answering our prayers in the way we expected, as if the creator of the universe must operate according to our limited vision of what is good and necessary. The danger of this habit is that it creates an idol within the mind. You think you're devoted to God, but you're actually devoted to your own mental construction. Ibn Arabi explains that this is one of the greatest veils because the person remains convinced they are devoted to the true divine while actually being devoted to their own imagination. The ego finds this arrangement quite comfortable because it allows us to feel spiritual while remaining in control. We create a God that validates our preferences, confirms our biases, and never truly challenges the foundations of our being. Consider the story of Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, when he asked to see God directly. The Quran tells us that when God manifested his glory to the mountain, it crumbled to dust, and Moses fell unconscious. This story isn't just about the incomprehensible power of the divine. It's about the complete inadequacy of our mental constructs when faced with the reality of God. Moses, who spoke directly with God, still could not contain the fullness of divine reality in his consciousness. How then can we, with our limited minds and conditioned perspectives, claim to fully understand the divine? The antidote to this hidden habit begins with what Ibn Arabi calls sacred bewilderment. This is the spiritual state of recognizing that God is always more than what you think, always beyond your categories, always transcending your expectations. It means approaching prayer not with demands and expectations, but with genuine surrender and openness to whatever the divine wisdom deems appropriate. It means acknowledging that your understanding of mercy, justice, love, and wisdom are finite approximations of infinite divine attributes. When you catch yourself thinking you know exactly what God wants, pause. When you find yourself judging someone else's spiritual journey based on your conception of proper devotion, stop. When you feel anger or disappointment with God because reality didn't match your expectations, recognize this as a sign that you've been worshipping your mental construct rather than the true divine. The true path begins when you empty your cup of preconceptions and allow the infinite to flow in without resistance. The second hidden spiritual habit that creates distance from the divine is what we might call the performance of spirituality without inner transformation. This is perhaps the most common trap among sincere seekers. We engage in spiritual practices, we adopt the appearance of devotion, we speak the language of the path, but our inner reality remains unchanged. We collect spiritual experiences like trophies, we accumulate knowledge like wealth, and we build a spiritual identity that impresses others and satisfies our ego, all while the heart remains hard and disconnected from the divine. Ibn Arabi was profoundly aware of this trap. In his writings, he distinguishes between those who know about God and those who know God. The difference is not in the quantity of practices performed but in the quality of presence and the sincerity of transformation. He taught that a single moment of genuine presence with God is worth more than years of mechanical worship. Yet how often do we pray while our minds wander to tomorrow's appointments? How often do we recite sacred words while our hearts remain preoccupied with worldly concerns? How often do we perform acts of devotion to maintain our spiritual self-image rather than from genuine love and longing for the divine? This habit is particularly insidious because it feels like progress. You're doing all the right things, attending gatherings of remembrance, reading spiritual texts, perhaps even teaching others about the path. But Ibn Arabi warns that spiritual practice without inner transformation is like a beautiful tree that produces no fruit. It may look impressive, but it serves no real purpose. The Quran reminds us that God does not look at your outward forms or your wealth, but He looks at your hearts and your deeds. The external practice is meant to be a vehicle for inner transformation, not a substitute for it. Consider how this manifests in daily life. Someone might fast regularly but speak harshly to their family. Another person might spend hours in prayer but remain consumed by anger and resentment. Someone else might lecture others about spiritual development while their own heart is filled with pride and judgment. These contradictions reveal that the practices have become performances rather than transformations. The spiritual acts are being used to build and maintain an identity, to gain respect from others, or to feel superior to those who don't practice in the same way. The Sufi masters tell the story of a man who spent decades in devoted worship, praying every prescribed prayer, fasting regularly, giving charity, and maintaining all the outward forms of spirituality. Yet when he encountered a simple shepherd who prayed in his own unorthodox way, speaking to God with the familiarity of a friend, the devout man became angry and corrected the shepherd harshly. That night, God revealed to the devout man that the shepherd's simple prayer, done with genuine love and presence, was more beloved than decades of mechanically perfect worship done from habit and ego. This story isn't meant to discourage proper practice, but to highlight that the value of any spiritual act lies in the presence and sincerity with which it's performed. Ibn Arabi teaches that every spiritual practice should function as a mirror, reflecting back to you the state of your inner reality. Prayer should reveal your capacity for presence. Fasting should expose your attachments. Charity should demonstrate your relationship with material things. If these practices are being performed correctly, they will inevitably challenge and transform you. They will hurt your ego. They will disturb your comfort. They will force you to confront the aspects of yourself that you'd rather ignore. If your spiritual practice always feels comfortable and validating, if it never challenges you or makes you uncomfortable, then it has likely become a performance rather than a transformation. Before we continue deeper into this journey of understanding, I want you to reflect for a moment on what we've explored so far. Think about your own spiritual life and these hidden habits we've discussed. Have you noticed these patterns in yourself? Take a moment right now and leave a comment sharing which of these hidden spiritual habits you recognize in your own practice. Your insight might help someone else on their journey, and this act of honest reflection is itself a step toward removing these veils. Share your thoughts about these hidden spiritual habits that distance us from the divine, and let's create a community of honest seekers supporting one another. The third hidden spiritual habit that creates distance from the divine is what Ibn Arabi described as the seeking of spiritual states and experiences rather than seeking God himself. This subtle trap catches many sincere seekers, especially in our modern age where spiritual experiences are often treated as the goal rather than as signs along the path. We become addicted to the feeling of connection, the emotional highs of spiritual practice, the extraordinary experiences that make us feel special and advanced. But in this seeking, we've replaced the divine with our desire for particular experiences, and once again, the ego has hijacked the spiritual journey. Ibn Arabi understood this deeply because he himself experienced profound spiritual states and visions. Yet he consistently warned his students not to become attached to these experiences or to judge their spiritual progress by the presence or absence of such states. In his work, he explains that God may grant someone overwhelming spiritual experiences to attract them to the path initially, but then withdraw those experiences to see if they were truly seeking God or merely seeking the pleasure of the experience. This withdrawal is itself a divine gift, an opportunity to purify one's intention and deepen one's sincerity. Think about how this operates in practice. Someone might begin a spiritual practice and experience profound peace, a sense of connection, perhaps even visions or insights that feel transcendent. These experiences are beautiful and can be genuinely from the divine. The problem arises when we start practicing specifically to recreate those experiences. When the experiences don't come, we feel we've failed or that God has abandoned us. We might jump from practice to practice, teacher to teacher, seeking that next spiritual high. We evaluate our spiritual state based on how we feel rather than on the quality of our character and the sincerity of our surrender. Ibn Arabi teaches that the mature spiritual path is characterized by what he calls contraction and expansion. Sometimes God draws near and you feel the overwhelming presence of the divine. Sometimes God seems distant and you feel nothing despite your prayers and practices. Both states are gifts. Both are necessary for spiritual development. The expansion opens your heart and gives you strength for the journey. The contraction purifies your intention and teaches you to seek God for God's sake alone, not for the pleasure of connection. If you only seek the expansion, if you only want the consolation without the desolation, then you're not truly seeking God but rather seeking a particular feeling that you've labeled as spiritual. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, experienced this himself. There were times when revelation flowed continuously, when the angel Gabriel visited frequently, when the connection with the divine was constant and overwhelming. But there were also periods of silence, times when the revelation paused, when the heavens seemed distant. These periods were so difficult that the Prophet worried that God had abandoned him. Yet the Quran was revealed to assure him that his Lord had not forgotten him and that what was to come would be better than what had passed. If the Prophet himself, the most beloved of creation, experienced this alternation of presence and absence, why do we expect our path to be only sweetness and light? The Sufi tradition is filled with stories of great saints who experienced years of dryness after their initial awakening. They continued their practices not because they felt anything, not because they experienced any spiritual consolation, but purely out of love and duty to the divine. This is what Ibn Arabi calls true servanthood. The one who worships in expansion and contraction equally, who seeks God in presence and absence, who maintains their practice whether they feel spiritual or completely mundane. This constancy, this faithfulness regardless of experience, is what refines the soul and removes the veils between the seeker and the sought. Consider also how this habit manifests in spiritual bypassing. Someone might use spiritual practices and states to avoid dealing with their psychological wounds, their relational conflicts, or their practical responsibilities. They might retreat into meditation or prayer as an escape from the difficulties of life rather than as a source of strength to face those difficulties with wisdom and grace. They might claim spiritual experiences to position themselves above others or to avoid criticism. Ibn Arabi is clear that true spirituality doesn't remove you from the world but transforms how you engage with it. The greatest saints appeared completely ordinary in their daily lives, conducting business, maintaining families, serving their communities, all while their inner reality was constantly connected to the divine. So what does it mean to seek God rather than seeking spiritual states? It means showing up for your practices whether you feel anything or not. It means measuring your progress not by the intensity of your experiences but by the transformation of your character. Are you becoming more patient? More compassionate? More honest? More humble? More generous? These are the real signs of spiritual development. Ibn Arabi teaches that the one who truly knows God is recognized not by their supernatural experiences but by their beautiful character and their service to creation. The Quran tells us that whoever does good has done it for themselves, and whoever does evil has done it against themselves, for your Lord is never unjust to his servants. If you've found value in this exploration so far, if these insights have helped you recognize patterns in your own spiritual journey, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We're building a community of sincere seekers who want to go beyond superficial spirituality and engage with the deep wisdom of the tradition. By subscribing, you'll ensure that you don't miss future content that can support your journey of removing these veils and drawing closer to the divine. Your support helps us continue creating content that prioritizes depth and authenticity over quick views and superficial engagement. Now, having explored these 3 hidden spiritual habits, we must address the crucial question: how do we actually remove these veils and return to genuine connection with the divine? Ibn Arabi provides us with a framework for this transformation, and it begins with what he calls muhasaba, which means taking account of oneself. This isn't the same as the harsh self-judgment that many people confuse with spiritual practice. Rather, it's a gentle but honest observation of your inner states, your motivations, and your patterns. It's looking at yourself with the compassion of a loving parent who wants the best for their child, but with the clarity of a skilled physician who must diagnose accurately to heal effectively. Every evening before sleep, Ibn Arabi recommends reviewing your day. Not to beat yourself up for your failures, but to observe where these hidden habits showed up. When did you worship your conception of God rather than God himself? Notice the moments when you became rigid or judgmental, when you tried to fit the divine into your box of expectations. When did you perform spirituality without genuine presence? Notice the times when you went through the motions, when your prayers were mechanical, when you did things for appearance rather than from sincere devotion. When did you seek experiences rather than seeking God? Notice when you were chasing feelings, when you evaluated your spiritual state based on emotions rather than character, when you became attached to particular states or disappointed by their absence. This practice of self-observation is not meant to burden you with guilt but to awaken you to the unconscious patterns that keep you veiled. Ibn Arabi teaches that most people are asleep even while they think they're awake. They move through life on autopilot, driven by conditioning and habit, never truly present to the reality of their existence or their relationship with the divine. The first step toward transformation is simply becoming aware, seeing clearly what has been operating in darkness. Once you see these patterns clearly, they begin to lose their power. The veil that is recognized can be removed. The second aspect of removing these veils is cultivating what Ibn Arabi calls the station of no station. This means not becoming attached to any particular spiritual state, identity, or understanding. It means remaining fluid and open, always willing to have your understanding expanded, your certainty dissolved, your spiritual identity stripped away. This is uncomfortable for the ego, which wants stability and certainty. The ego wants to say, I am a spiritual person who has achieved this level and knows these truths. But the reality of the divine is infinite and ever-revealing. The moment you think you've grasped it, you've lost it. The moment you feel you've arrived, you've stopped journeying. This doesn't mean abandoning all frameworks or practices. Rather, it means holding them lightly, using them as tools rather than treating them as ultimate truths. It means being willing to let God surprise you, to let your understanding be shattered and rebuilt, to let your carefully constructed spiritual identity die so that something more authentic can emerge. Ibn Arabi often quoted the Quranic verse that states, "Every day he is in a state of glory," meaning that God is constantly manifesting in new ways, revealing new aspects of infinite reality. If God is constantly new, how can we remain static in our understanding and approach? The third practice for removing these veils is developing what the Sufis call adab, which can be translated as sacred courtesy or spiritual courtesy. This is the art of showing up properly in each moment, with the appropriate attitude and awareness. It means coming to prayer not as a routine to check off but as a meeting with the beloved. It means engaging with sacred texts not to accumulate knowledge but to be transformed. It means treating every moment as potentially sacred, every encounter as potentially divine. When you eat, eat with awareness and gratitude. When you work, work as an act of worship. When you speak, speak as if the divine is listening, which of course, the divine always is. This sacred courtesy extends to how you treat yourself. Ibn Arabi teaches that you are a manifestation of divine attributes, a mirror in which the divine beholds itself. To treat yourself with contempt or cruelty is to insult the divine artist who created you. This doesn't mean indulging your ego or excusing harmful behavior. Rather, it means approaching your own transformation with the same gentleness and wisdom that you would want a beloved teacher to approach you with. When you notice these hidden habits operating, don't collapse into shame and self-attack. Instead, say to yourself with compassion, "Ah, there's that pattern again. Now I see it more clearly. What does it have to teach me? What wound or fear is driving it? How can I gently redirect toward truth?" Ibn Arabi also emphasizes the importance of finding a guide or teacher who has traversed this path. These hidden habits are so subtle and the ego is so clever at disguising itself that most people cannot navigate this journey alone. A genuine teacher isn't someone who impresses you with their knowledge or their spiritual powers. Rather, a genuine teacher is someone who sees through your defenses, who can identify the specific veils that obscure your vision, and who has the wisdom and compassion to guide you toward removing them. The Prophet Muhammad said that the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets, and in the Sufi tradition, this inheritance is passed down through chains of realized teachers who have each walked the path from ignorance to knowledge, from distance to intimacy with the divine. However, be careful here as well, because the seeking of a teacher can itself become another form of these hidden habits. You might seek a teacher who validates your existing beliefs rather than one who challenges them. You might collect teachers like spiritual trophies, bouncing from one to another seeking that perfect teacher who will give you what you want rather than what you need. You might project onto the teacher your image of what enlightenment looks like, worshipping your projection rather than learning from the human being before you. True discipleship, according to Ibn Arabi, requires the death of your spiritual self-image, your submission to a process that will certainly be uncomfortable, and your willingness to have everything you think you know questioned and refined. The ultimate antidote to all three of these hidden spiritual habits is the cultivation of genuine love for God. Not love for the blessings that God gives, not love for the spiritual states you experience, not love for the identity of being a spiritual person, but pure love for the divine's own sake. Ibn Arabi speaks extensively about divine love in his works, explaining that this love is actually God's love for himself reflected in the mirror of the human heart. When you love God, God is loving himself through you. This love is not something you can manufacture through effort. Rather, it emerges naturally when the veils are removed and you begin to see reality as it truly is. How do you cultivate this love? Not through force or through trying to feel something you don't feel. Rather, through contemplation of the divine attributes, through observation of the signs of God's presence in creation, through remembrance of God's continuous gifts and blessings, through reading the stories of those who loved God deeply and seeing how that love transformed them. Ibn Arabi teaches that every beautiful thing you love in this world is actually a manifestation of divine beauty. When you love the kindness of a friend, you're loving the divine attribute of kindness manifesting through that friend. When you love the majesty of a mountain or the delicacy of a flower, you're loving divine majesty and divine subtlety. As you become more aware of this, your scattered loves begin to unify, pointing back to their single source. All the streams of love in your life begin flowing back to the ocean of divine love. The Quran tells us that those who believe are strongest in love for Allah. This isn't just poetic language. It's describing a state of being in which the divine is not a concept or a duty but the beloved, the one your heart yearns for, the source of all joy and meaning. When this love takes root in the heart, these hidden spiritual habits begin to dissolve naturally. You stop worshipping your conception of God because you're too busy being intoxicated by God's actual presence. You stop performing spirituality because you're too engaged in genuine transformation. You stop seeking spiritual states because you're too absorbed in seeking the one who grants those states. The entire orientation shifts from self-centered spirituality to God-centered spirituality, from asking what God can do for you to asking how you can serve the divine will. Let's conclude by returning to where we began. You may have started this exploration feeling confused about why your spiritual practices weren't bringing you the closeness to God that you longed for. Now you understand that the problem wasn't with the practices themselves but with three hidden habits that were operating beneath your awareness. The worship of your conception of God rather than God himself. The performance of spirituality without inner transformation. And the seeking of spiritual states and experiences rather than seeking God directly. These habits are not your fault. They are common traps that almost every sincere seeker falls into. But now that you see them clearly, you have the opportunity to begin removing these veils. This work of removing veils is the work of a lifetime. It requires patience, compassion for yourself, and willingness to be uncomfortable as old patterns die and new awareness emerges. But Ibn Arabi assures us that every step toward the divine is met by the divine taking 10 steps toward you. Every veil you remove brings you into greater clarity, greater peace, greater capacity to love and serve. The journey might be difficult, but the destination is worth every challenge. And truthfully, even the journey itself becomes beautiful once you stop fighting against it and surrender to the transformation that wants to happen within you. Remember that God is closer to you than your jugular vein, as the Quran tells us. The distance you feel is not because God is far away but because these veils obscure your perception. Remove the veils, and you'll discover what the mystics have always known: you've never actually been separate from the divine. The separation was an illusion created by these hidden habits of consciousness. Your true nature, your deepest reality, has always been intimately connected with God. The path is not about creating a connection that doesn't exist but about recognizing and living from the connection that has always been there. I'll leave you with one of Ibn Arabi's most profound teachings. He said that the person who knows themselves knows their Lord. This means that the journey inward and the journey toward God are ultimately the same journey. As you honestly examine these hidden spiritual habits within yourself, as you courageously face your own patterns and conditioning, as you allow transformation to occur, you're simultaneously drawing closer to the divine. The inner work is the spiritual work. The psychological is the mystical. The human is the divine mirror. Everything you need is already within you, waiting to be discovered and uncovered. So begin today. Tonight before you sleep, practice that self-observation that Ibn Arabi recommended. Notice when these 3 hidden habits appeared in your day. Do this not with harsh judgment but with curious compassion, like a scientist observing a fascinating phenomenon. Tomorrow, bring greater presence to your practices. Even if it's just one prayer or one moment of remembrance, do it with absolute sincerity and presence. Let that be your starting point. From there, the path will unfold naturally. The divine guides those who sincerely seek, and by engaging with this content, by reflecting on these teachings, you've demonstrated that sincerity. Trust that guidance is already flowing toward you, opening doors within your consciousness that you didn't even know were closed. Share this message with others who might benefit from understanding these hidden spiritual habits. Engage with our community in the comments, sharing your experiences and insights. And most importantly, take this wisdom into your actual lived experience. Let it transform not just your understanding but your way of being in the world. The greatest honor you can give to these teachings is to embody them, to let them reshape your relationship with yourself, with others, and with the divine. May your veils be lifted, may your heart be opened, and may you discover the intimacy with God that your soul has always longed for.